Thank you all for joining us for this webinar on polling and forecasting in elections. This event is co-hosted by the Department of Political Science at the University of Houston and the Harvard School of Public Affairs. I'm Pablo Pinto. I direct the Center of Public Policy at the Harvard School, and I'm an associate professor of public policy as well at the Harvard School. It's a great pleasure to have a good lineup of participants today. We have Professor Gail Buttorff, who's an assistant professor and director of the Survey Research Institute at the Harvard School of Public Affairs, and an expert on gender and public policy and political representation. And she does also research on methods, quantitative, formal, and experimental methods in the social sciences. We also have Jason Casellas, associate professor of political science at the University of Houston, an expert on Latino and American politics, legislative politics, state policy, and Latino politics and American politics in general. And we also have Scott Clifford, who's an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Houston, an expert on experimental methods and on moral suasion and political attitudes and the relationship between political entrepreneurship and representation. We also have Dr. Natalie Jackson, who's the director of research at the PRRI Religion Research Institute. She has a PhD in political science. She's an adjunct professor at American University and has lots of expertise on survey and experimental methods and has done a lot of work on the science of polling. And last but not least, we have Andrew Gelman, professor of statistics and political science at Columbia University, a well-known statistician and a political scientist with many awards and degrees and experts on forecasting and political participation, political representation, among other issues. This is an excellent lineup, and it's a pleasure to be moderating this conversation. We're going to start with presentations by the panelists between 5 to 10 minutes on some of the topics that come up, and in the recent election and in issues of polling and forecasting elections. And then we're going to open it up to our audience for questions and answers, and more a dynamic back and forth between panelists and the audience. So let me start with Jason, with Dr. Jason Casellas. And so one of the themes that we set up to discuss here are what surveys got right and wrong in the recent election. One of the areas where most people find some of these faults is with the Hispanic voters across the country, but also in different regions of the country. So it'd be very interesting to understand, and where and how, and the polls got the Hispanic vote wrong, and what we learned from those messes and opportunities.
Okay, thank you, Pablo, and thank you, Hobby School and Department of Political Science for hosting this webinar. It's great to be with everyone. So today I'm going to talk, as Pablo said, specifically about the Latino vote in the 2020 election and how it sort of is different and how it was similar to what we've seen in years past. The other panelists, I think, will go into more the bigger, I think, misses in the polling had to do with state polls in particular in places like the Midwest, like Wisconsin. But when we look at sort of the polling by state when it comes to Trump and Biden, what you see, of course, in this graph that's, I think, from the Washington Post, so you see, of course, Florida being a state where the Latino vote actually narrowly went to Joe Biden. Well, more than narrowly, actually, went to Joe Biden rather than Donald Trump, something that may be lost in a lot of the discussion about what happened in South Florida, which I'll talk about in just a second. But what you can see is pretty much in every state, Biden clearly getting most of the support among Hispanic voters. And, that's not anything really new when it comes to Democrats supporting, Latinos supporting Democrats. So historically, it's been about a 70-30 split, where 70% of Latinos vote for Democrats, 30% for Republican candidates. The exceptions were times like George W. Bush, beating that number up up to about 40% in his 2004 reelection. But in some states at the bottom, you see Pennsylvania with Biden doing much better among Latinos than Trump, and in a state like Pennsylvania, which was fairly close, you can argue that perhaps the Latino vote may have made a difference, right? But one of the things I want to talk about, that graph showed you the exit polls, and I think this is an important thing to consider here. There's divergence between the exit polls, which I just showed you, and some of the pre-election polls. So if you go to Election Eve 2020, it's a really nice website, Latino Decisions and other pollsters who did an Election Eve poll. One of the things that they were interested in doing is doing a poll that's more accurate in terms of getting these sort of small other groups like Latinos, African Americans, generally groups that are hard to poll. And so we say which are correct. I think one of the things to be wary about when it comes to exit polls, and I know there's been a long controversy about the overall accuracy of exit polls, especially in this election with a lot more people voting by mail and voting early. And so there's a lot of cause for skepticism on exit polls. And when it comes also to sort of what exit polls say about the Latino vote, often they're going to be really overestimating the Republican support. And that's why we've seen a lot of the exit polls show a much narrower race between sort of Biden and Trump, and then in previous elections, with other candidates. I think one of the issues with some of the polls, I think it's important that we have bilingual interviewers, which exit polls often don't do, because there is a difference between Spanish-speaking versus primarily English-speaking Latinos, where Spanish-speaking Latinos are more likely to support Democrats generally, and then also sort of how individuals are contacted, by phone, by text, or online outreach. And so, pollsters have to do a lot of innovation, especially these days, when you're talking about groups that are historically more difficult to reach. This past year, I was involved with CMAS here at the University of Houston and Univision. We did a national poll, and of course, the statewide poll was what we're interested in Texas. And this was just before the election in late October. And, the final breakdown in that poll, we had Trump at 49 and Biden at 46 for the overall and Trump. And I know Hobby School also had a poll, which was a little bit different. It was 50, I think, for Trump and 46 for Biden. And at the end of the day, I think both polls did a fairly good job. If you have here a margin of error of 2.2%, if you look at the final outcome in Texas, it was 52% or so for Trump. And so with Latinos, we found that 66% of Latinos in Texas supported Biden and 28% supported Trump. And again, here we see some narrative about what happened in South Texas, which I want to address real quickly. The first thing I want to say is that it is problematic to lump all Latinos into the same category. And those of us who study Latino politics for years have been saying this forever. But nevertheless, there is a sense in which oftentimes pundits and others just try to lump Latinos all together. And you have a lot of different national origin groups with quite a lot of different past experiences. So that's something to take into account. I've already said this, but about 70% have historically supported Democrats and 30% for Republicans. So what we saw in this election was about that. Trump doing a little bit less than that, about 28%. I think what's different and what many people are saying is Trump improved. Well, sure, he improved. He improved from a low showing of 18% in 2016 to 28% in 2020. And so when we talk about that improvement, we're talking about an improvement from an all-time low. And I think one of the reasons for this is that immigration was not as salient of an issue in 2020. Recall in 2016, of course, immigration and the rhetoric that was used by the president, turned off a lot of Latinos, especially some Latino Republicans. And what we saw also in terms of what happened in South Texas, which is something that's getting a lot of attention, where you have this rural community on the border. One of the things that's often talked about is Second Amendment, issues about abortion, about religion, about the oil and gas industry, and sort of some of the comments made by Biden in the last debate about that industry. But there's also a larger issue about the economy and sort of the issue of lockdowns, and that sort of many small business owners perhaps move to Trump because of the impact of the lockdowns on their small businesses. And that's something that you don't hear a lot about, but I think that could also help explain some of this. But recall the Valley, we have, in terms of the overall population of Hispanic voters, it's only 15%. So we're talking about small vote numbers there. And so I think what's missing in the overall narrative is that if you look at Houston and you look at Dallas and San Antonio, and you look at those precincts and you do studies of those precincts that are heavily Hispanic, you see basically that 70-30 split, more or less, or maybe a little bit higher. And so obviously the South Texas, where Trump did much better than he did 4 years ago, and even in one county, narrowly winning that county, Zapata County, it's still the case that overall, that Biden did win, about 2/3 of the Latino vote in the state of Texas. It's not to say that it's not important what these folks were saying or doing by voting for Trump in South Texas, but I think that's important to put into context with the larger picture. Of course, South Florida gets a lot of attention because of the Cuban American vote in particular, which again, Miami-Dade County overall went for Biden, but a lot of these Cuban American precincts, the Trump campaign, I think, did a good job in terms of reaching out to these Cuban Americans, but also Venezuelans, by sort of painting a narrative of Biden as being sort of socialist or being sort of captured by the socialist wing of the Democratic Party. And so that kind of messaging, I think, moved a lot of voters in the Republican direction among these groups in South Florida, which of course, made it such that Trump won the state a little bit more easily than he would have won it if the numbers were similar to what we saw in 2016. But even in 2018, recall that Florida, in a state that was really good, in a election that was really good for Democrats, Florida, elected a Republican governor, and Senator Bill Nelson, the Democrat, was defeated by Rick Scott. So the state has been trending overall a little bit more Republican, and it's not just because of this South Florida phenomenon, but has a lot of other reasons for it. So I'll just conclude by making a few kind of points here that, again, Latino vote is not homogenous. So, these Cuban Americans, Puerto Ricans in Florida and Orlando area are much less democratic than Puerto Ricans in New York. So this is an interesting kind of thing to look at, that we shouldn't just assume Puerto Ricans in New York versus Florida will kind of vote the same way, that there are a lot of differences. And even the Trump campaign reached out to Puerto Ricans by using sort of ads in sort of Puerto Rican Spanish versus the ads in South Florida with Cuban American or Cuban Spanish, so to speak. So these kind of things matter, and the kind of issues matter, like hurricane relief for Puerto Ricans was much more of an issue for them than this issue of socialism. And I think polling must be sensitive to the Spanish language respondents and also hard to reach populations. I think we've gotten better at that, but a lot of the national polls have not done that. And so that's why we should be skeptical about some of the estimates about Latinos in those polls. In the big picture, though, Latino turnout is the highest it's ever been in this last election, about 14.8 million. You can argue that Arizona, which was a state that was so close, that Latinos helped flip Arizona. And, the problems with polling misses, I think, really were more of an issue in the upper Midwest, with white voters. And some of the other folks on the panel, I'm sure, will say a lot more about that. But I think what happened in South Florida and South Texas, these are important things to look at and to dig into more. But these are small slices of the entire Latino electorate. And perhaps these issues are idiosyncratic for this year. There perhaps may be in the future. Some of these issues may come back, in terms of how President Biden, once he becomes president, will be sort of characterized. But at the end of the day, I think looking at Latino voters is an important thing to look at, because it's a growing population, 17% of the US population. And of course, here in Texas, about 40% and growing. And so I'll stop there, and I look forward to our conversation. Any questions?
unmute myself. So this is great. Thank you so much, Jason. Let's move to Gail. So we've been talking about these issues of polling and missing or not, or getting it accurate. What's so peculiar about polling elections as opposed to polling, I mean, it's like political attitudes or doing pollings for marketing and other areas, right? It's like, is there anything peculiar about this relation between the polling, the information we got from polling, and it's like media, it's like journalists, pundits, political campaigns and voters that might be relevant for this issue, that might be different and not create such a concern that surveying is dead?
Right. So first, the main point I want to make is, when we are sort of digesting the polls and talking about the problems with polls, it's of course important, as I'm sure my fellow panelists will agree, to distinguish between, pre-election polling, election forecasting, and then issue or public opinion more generally. There are some issues that are common to both pre-election polling and forecasting, as well as issue polling generally, but some are definitely more unique to the pre-election polls and are much more problematic for forecasting, and are sort of what is now quite salient in the news media. I think also another point is that you've heard a lot of academics and pundits talk about, it seemed a lot worse, the day after or the night of than what is it turning out to be as the final vote counts are actually tallied. And as Jason mentioned, some of the issues seem to be more prominent in some areas than in other areas, like, for example, the upper Midwest. One of the issues that is common to both, to election polling and issue polling is, low response rates. And so one of the theories about, or one of the preliminary theories about why, the election polls, quote unquote, went so wrong in 2020 was that you have potentially a partisan response, whereas Republican voters are potentially less likely or less willing to participate in surveys, and or Democratic voters are more likely or more willing to participate in surveys because they're super jazzed up this election, they're more enthusiastic and more willing to participate in polls. The more general issue, of course, for polling, not just election polling, is low response rate. So according to Pew Research Center, their response rates are down, for telephone surveys, are down to about 6%, compared to even like 9 or 10% a few years earlier. So there's very low response rates. It's harder to get people, not just, Hispanic, Black Americans, other more traditionally hard to reach populations, but it's harder to poll Americans in general. And it would be interesting to sort of, I was talking to some Jordanian colleagues this morning from Ipsos, and they were saying, their phone response rate is now 30%, so it's much higher in different countries. But in the United States, response rates to telephone is very low. Now, if we assume that, those that do respond are more or less representative of the population, then the low response rates are not necessarily an issue. However, it is an issue for costs. So the survey with those response rates, the cost of polling is increasing dramatically. So one poll we fielded for the state of Texas 2 months ago, we did, multi-mode, but for the phone surveys, it took 1,000 more hours than anticipated to get the full 1,100 respondents by phone. So that's obviously increases the cost and increases the number of phone calls you need to make and so on. Now, the other issue is, of course, it's not only more costly, but the issue is if there is that systematic difference between those that are responding and not responding. And I think we have some good evidence that there is, specifically in regard to election polling. So for example, one of the big changes a lot of pollsters made between 2016 and 2020 was to wait for education because they were underrepresenting voters without a college education in 2016, and they were more likely to favor Trump as a candidate over Hillary Clinton. And I think you continue to see that, some preliminary evidence that it was, again, harder to get white rural voters without college education in 2020 as well. So I'll conclude there for now. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. So these are important points to consider the issue of people's trust or mistrust on polls. So Scott, I'm gonna yield to you. I mean, it's like, and there are a couple of issues here that might be related to this idea of whether people are trusting or mistrusting polls and its consequences in terms of our political representation, political behavior, political mobilization alike. But one of the elements that was brought here is that the issue polling as opposed to election polling is the idea of what we want to make in terms of predictions, right? So predicting outcomes as opposed to describing them, it's like attitudes towards different candidates, right? So I mean, it's like you see that might be an issue that creates high expectations that then eventually implode and lead to mistrusting polls that might backfire and lead to this process that Gail was describing, that people are not willing to respond.
Yeah, so let me just, I guess, build a little bit on what Gail and you were saying here, Pablo. And that's just in making a distinction between forecasting, election forecasting, and polling here, right? Because polling, a typical survey, we're just trying to measure public opinion at a specific point in time, right? It gives us a snapshot of what public opinion is. It's no guarantee of what public opinion will look like in the future. In contrast with election forecasting, we're trying to take that poll, that snapshot, and say something about what public opinion will look like in the future, right? Making an assumption that public opinion is not going to change much. Now, maybe it doesn't a lot when it comes to vote choice, at least in the short term. But we always have at least some undecided voters who won't tell us who they're voting for or don't know yet in a survey that can lead to error. But then there's also the question of turnout, right? Besides just measuring opinion, hoping that opinion is stable over time, we've also got to predict their behavior in the future about whether they're going to vote. It turns out that's a really hard thing to do. We're bad at predicting our own behavior in the future, let alone telling a pollster how we're going to behave. That can be a major source of error potentially in election forecasting that really differs from what a typical survey is trying to do. So I think it's really important to keep those 2 points in mind, and that election forecasting errors aren't equivalent to polling errors. And so it may be that these two come apart. Maybe our forecasts are not doing well because of turnout. Maybe it has to do with changing opinion or these don't know responses. I don't think those two factors explain all of the myths, certainly, but it's something that we need to be cautious of, because I think there are implications in terms of public opinion and representation and what we think about surveys and the quality of polling. So I'll talk a little bit about the potential stakes here. So I think it's easy to forget that polling is important in terms of representation, right? That's the best method we have for figuring out what the public wants when it comes to public policy. And we know that politicians, a lot of them anyway, rely pretty heavily on polling to decide what they ought to do, what they ought to talk about or emphasize, prioritize. In fact, we have experimental evidence that when we offer politicians polling information, they're more likely to vote on a bill in a way that better represents their constituents. And I think that's a good thing. So we want politicians to be able to trust and rely on this polling information. But I worry that, with all the talk about polling misses in 2020 and 2016, that we may be undermining trust in polling, maybe more so than is deserved. Maybe some loss of trust is deserved, but we ought to be a little cautious in what sort of inferences we draw from these last couple of presidential elections. And in terms of thinking about this in terms of representation, right, we know at the national level, polls were off maybe 3 or 4 points in the last couple of elections. Now, 3 or 4 points may be big in terms of trying to predict an election, but in terms of measuring public policy, I think is not so big, especially when you compare it to alternatives. So if politicians are not relying on polling information to try to figure out what their constituents want. What are they relying on? Maybe the views of their friends, their immediate peers and colleagues, who emails them or writes them letters. And these are clearly not representative sources of public opinion. So that they have massive biases in them. So even if polling is imperfect, which it is, of course, we need to keep in mind what's our alternative source of information here. But I worry not just about declining trust in polling, but also polarization in it, right? Because I'm sure Democrats probably feel a little burnt by polling and election forecasts over these last 2 cycles, but I think Republicans and the mass public in particular may feel decline in trust in polls because they see that their side is being underrepresented in polls. And so that may lead to this asymmetric decline in trust. And that's something that fits pretty easily within the narrative sort of anti-journalism, anti-expertise that's been common among some Republicans. So one of the consequences, maybe we don't care that much about whether the public trusts in polls, but we probably need some of that trust to get people to participate in polls. So maybe the problems pollsters were facing started with education or maybe low social trust or something like that. But if the public is seeing these polls systematically biased in one direction, that may really undermine trust among Republicans, causing them to be even less likely to participate in a poll given that they're asked. So that could make this problem even harder, make these biases even worse, and potentially give us sort of a feedback problem here. So I guess just to wrap up my points here, I do worry about the quality of polling, and obviously we had a few big misses with election forecasts, but we need to separate those two and just be a little cautious in the inferences we draw about polling from these forecasts. And I'm, I guess, more worried about what that means for how politicians and the public use this information and what it means for representation.
Great, thank you. I've been thinking of this issue on trusting polls and Mislead and the whole expectation that pre-election polls should be predictive, I mean, of the actual outcome of the election. So I'm going to move to Natalie. I think you have some ideas on this. So is this expectation something that creates too much hype that actually could lead, I mean, it's like to identifying that the polls are missing more than we expect them to miss? So I mean, it's like, and why is this different when we do pre-election polls as opposed to other types of pollings, if at all?
Yeah, hi. So I'm happy to be with all of you today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of some of the themes that have emerged and tying it all together. So one of the things that's come up in the post-election discourse is, you know, kind of the idea of there are competing ideas, right? Polls have missed 2 elections in a row, or at least that's been the widespread perception. There have definitely been issues in the same direction, 2 election cycles in a row. And at the same time, you have analysts looking back at polling error historically saying, this is not really any worse than polls usually are. In fact, it's about normal. So what's the difference? Why are we seeing so much more faith being put in polling? And as I thought this through, this issue of, you know, this whole sort of ecosystem has developed around election polling in the last 15 years. And I say last 15 years largely because that's when I've been active in the survey research field. And so I feel like I've watched this develop. You know, in the early 2000s, we had aggregators start. You know, 2008 kind of kicked off the forecasting based on polling in the media type of thing. And it's just expanded since then. So the way I like to think about it is that the pre-election polling field is no longer just pollsters putting their data out there, right? We've got this entire ecosystem and there are 4 major players in it. Obviously the pollsters are one. Aggregators and forecasters, people who use publicly released polls to create additional products, are another one of the components. The media, of course, is one. And consumers, the public who goes out and finds these polls or seeks them out or is refreshing 538 every 5.38 seconds. I know many people who know better who still do that. So all four of these constituencies have kind of worked together to create this ecosystem. Pollsters want the media attention that comes with putting out reliable election estimates and getting picked up in aggregates and forecast models. Forecasters and aggregators need the information to feed their models, and they also need media attention to, bring attention to their products. The media has this 24-hour news cycle that they need content for, and as consumers, we've gotten very accustomed to having everything at our fingertips 24 hours a day. And so why would the answer to a future election not be at our fingertips as well? So we've got this whole ecosystem where it's just really pushed polling out into the forefront, pre-election polling, that's what I'm referring to. And it regularly pushes past what polls in themselves are capable of doing. We definitely have issues in polling. Pollsters have already started the introspection required to do this. Some are much more dire in their early conclusions than others, but it's not clear to me from where I sit. And I've worked on all sides of this ecosystem. I started out in graduate school as an observer and a consumer. I then have worked as a pollster at both the state and national level, as well as I've been an aggregator and forecaster for the media. So I've been on kind of all parts of this ecosystem. And I don't think that any one group realizes how intertwined they all are in perpetuating the concept that polls are predictive and should be perfect. So pollsters like to say that polls are snapshots, not predictions. At the same time, horse race numbers get interpreted as predictive in part due to the choices that pollsters are making. Pollsters are projecting likely voters, a population that doesn't exist. The very practice of trying to develop a likely voter model is trying to predict the electorate. So that in itself becomes predictive, and you kind of can't blame people for perceiving it that way. One possible avenue that I've seen some pollsters explore that I personally really like is providing multiple estimates or ranges of estimates, something to demonstrate that this likely voter model is not a certainty, it's a guess. It's an educated guess, but it's still a guess. Aggregators and forecasters are taking all the data they can possibly get. Some sorted a little bit. The economist model made a few cuts based on data quality. Nobody's really sure what Real Clear Politics does. 538 takes anything and everything. Well, not all polls deserve to see the light of day, yet low quality polls are flooding aggregates and forecasts. So how much attention and understanding of the nuances are we giving if we're just churning out repeated huge samples day after day? We saw this pretty clearly with the final Iowa poll from Seltzer, which was an apparent outlier that actually turned out to be correct. In both of the major forecast models that I looked at, it moved the win probabilities in Iowa about 0.2 of a percentage point. So this outlier poll was not allowed to have any pull, hardly, on the uncertainty in these models because there were so many other polls. So the aggregator and forecaster function could become a key gatekeeping thing and actually improve the need for uncertainty in these models by restricting and not letting polls see the light of day that should have never been allowed to see the light of day. Media reliance on all these things, of course, is just incredible. They often lack the expertise or the time to really dig in and explore. While most pollsters did emphasize that new issues could come up, the main media take was that, oh, pollsters fixed what they were doing in 2016. When in fact, if you read into the quotes that pollsters were giving the media, pollsters were saying, but there are other things that could happen, including a pandemic. So media also hypes the horse race way too much. There are so many more interesting things in polls that the media doesn't pick up. Also, pollsters could, lead their press releases with something besides the horse race if they want to, help this issue as well. And finally, consumers need to change how they think about what polls or poll-based forecasts say. Stop clicking on 538 every 5 seconds. Stop refreshing your models. Stop, just accept that predicting the future isn't possible and that polls and forecasts don't make it possible. As humans, we're really bad with uncertainty, and we like to think that, again, we should have all this information at our fingertips, but this is one where we just don't. So, the bottom line here is that everyone will need to cooperate and work together in this ecosystem to improve the situation for polling. And, I would posit that why should I trust polls is not the question you should ask. You should be asking, why did you ever trust them to show you an unknowable future? And I think it's because this entire ecosystem has developed around the idea that we can predict an unknowable future. And I would just note that if we want to see anything change, everyone has to be involved in the solution, not just pollsters. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natalie. A lot of food for thought here. I'd be interested, Andy, in getting your thoughts on this issue. Polls are used to gauge preferences, right? I mean, something that resides within our minds, right? It's like, and we're trying to elicit that by asking questions to people, and it's like, and we ask questions about different issues, right? From issues of what people want to buy in the marketplace to political preferences to policy preferences, and in particular in this case is trying to identify who the winner of the next election might be based on public sentiment. What are your views on these? And as one of the questions I would like to ask. And the second part is like you've been very active in forecasting, right? It's like I'm building those forecasting models. So I would like, it's like if you could address some of the technical issues that you face, it's like and whether or not and what you see about that enterprise and your contribution to that enterprise.
Okay. So I'll say a bunch of things in no particular order. First, election polling versus opinion polling. There are a few differences. One thing people noted was that in election polling, you care about predicting who's going to vote. In opinion polling, you care about everybody. So in some sense, it's easier to do opinion polling because you don't need to forecast who's going to vote. But not really, because politicians probably don't care that much about the opinion of people who don't vote. I mean, they care a little bit about people who don't vote but participate in other ways. But then that gets to the question of using the poll to find out how people participate in other ways, which is itself a challenge. I think the main difference between the main reason why pre-election polling is considered to be harder than opinion polling is the precision that people are demanding. So with the polls are off by 2.5 percentage points, which some people like to say is 5 percentage points on the difference, which is kind of tacky. So I would say 2.5 percentage points. That's bad. Like 2.5 percentage points, it's a lot. You miscall some Senate races and so forth. On the other hand, what if you said, what's the support for the minimum wage increase? Well, I don't know what it is, but suppose the polls say 90% and it's really only 80%. Or 70, or who cares, right? Public opinion, you don't need that kind of precision. Similarly, with public opinion, you're usually concerned not so much about the level as the change. So the death penalty remains popular in this country, but it used to be that the death penalty was increasing in popularity and it was a really great political issue. The trend has been for it, that hasn't been happening anymore. And so it's considered to be okay to oppose it. And a lot of issues are like that. The issues like same-sex marriage was trending popular even before it had the support of 50% of the people. If you're interested in trends, then having a bias of 2.5 percentage points isn't so important. Also, public, who you're going to vote for, says one person said, we often can't say ourselves, so I think we can all say how we would vote ahead of time, but a lot of survey respondents might not be able to assess that. However, actually, it's very predictable how you're going to vote. Votes are very stable. There's only a few swing voters out there. Even turnout is pretty predictable. It's the swing turnout people you're concerned about. Public opinion is different. So there was, back in 2008, 75% of people supported healthcare reform. And somewhere around 2009, it became 50%. Now, what does that mean? What happened to those 25%? That was soft support. So again, no one's expecting it. You don't need precision to the level of 2.5 percentage points to estimate something that's shifting by 25 percentage points in 1 year. I might not have the exact numbers right, but that's the basic idea. Also, somewhere related is intensity of preference, which seems important for certain political issues. For voting, it's complicated. If you have a more intense preference, presumably you're more likely to vote. On the other hand, those are people who are also presumably more likely to respond to surveys. So adjustments for intensity can backfire in that you've already overrepresented the more intense respondents. And so if you try to give your candidate extra benefit for that, that can hurt, but not always. So it's difficult. There was a comment about how we can get people to participate in polls, and that's kind of the problem, is that people like us make money off of polls, off of survey respondents who answer questions for free. So I think of survey response as a little bit like that famous aquifer in the middle of the country that they've been draining for the past 70 years, and it's almost out of water, right? And then they won't be able to grow alfalfa in Nebraska or whatever the hell they do out there. And I think that social scientists and campaigns have been mining the non-renewable resource of survey respondents. And back in the 1950s, if someone were to survey you, if you were to be called by the Gallup poll, it would be very rational to respond to the survey, because you'd be one of 1,500 people. Your results would be reported, the results would be reported in the national news. Policy could be affected by your survey response. Literally, your response could change policy. It could, it could have convinced, Eisenhower to depose another, democratically elected, president somewhere in the world, like whatever the hell they were doing back in the 1950s. Your poll response could have mattered. Nowadays, there are so many polls that one response isn't going to matter. It's rational for people not to respond to polls. Instead of asking who are these weird survey non-respondents, we're saying who are these weird people who respond to polls? Who are these people who are so lonely and desperate that they're willing to talk to some stranger and tell them how they're going to vote? Right? From that standpoint, it's stunning that they're only off by 2.5 percentage points, and not like, it's stunning that they're not all like exit polls, and not all off by 20 percentage points. It's so yeah, like I'm very uncomfortable with the idea that we should somehow be like, oh, isn't it too bad? Like people are they no longer have trust. People should have trust. I don't think people should have trust in pollsters. Pollsters are people who make money off of their free survey responses. It's like Facebook, except you don't get some fun website. You don't get to talk to your friends. You just give out data, and then somebody else makes money. The online polling panels, like they pay people. I think that's only fair. Regarding the poll in Iowa, I was thinking about this. So I was talking with a colleague about this the other day, that suppose that we had, the polls can be off. That's in our model. That's why our forecasting model had wide uncertainties. We could, but suppose you knew something. Suppose you said, well, I think this poll by this organization, they're really good. Okay. So to get that, you could throw away every other poll in Iowa and you just had that, and we would still end up, you'd still end up thinking that Iowa was going to be closer than it was, because there's also the national polls. I guess what I'm getting at is, if you want to count that poll more, it's not just a matter of throwing away the really bad polls. And it's not a matter of saying, I like this poll. You have to affirm, you have to either say you're very sure that this poll has essentially zero non-sampling error, which of course you wouldn't do because it's just one poll and there can be non-sampling error, or you'd have to really say that the other polls could be even worse. You'd have to make a strong statement about that. So it would be difficult to do that ahead of time. Without like breaking things down into the raw data. Conversely, amazingly enough, if you were to really trust that Iowa poll, like give that a zero non-sampling error, that would have corrected all the other 50 states quite a bit, because the correlation in the forecast between different states is quite high. And if you were to really say that particular poll was accurate to within its stated sampling error, which is much more precise than we would say, that would automatically end up dragging along Florida and Pennsylvania and all the other states to some extent. So there, it's like I'm agreeing there with Natalie that these choices in the data matter, but unfortunately it's not going to be just enough to not include some bad polls, I think. Finally, regarding the idea that we're predicting the future and that's impossible, we can predict a bunch of things. Some people got annoyed at us because we said there was a 99% chance that Joe Biden would win the popular vote. So I guess we got lucky. He did win the popular vote. So say, I guess 51% of Americans or whatever it is. But if you, like, I think we did have information about that. And certainly if you don't want to say that, you can certainly say we're pretty damn sure Biden was going to win more than 45% of the two-party vote. So we have some knowledge. There was another prominent forecaster, not the Economist forecaster, and they were going around saying that that Joe Biden had a 6% chance of winning South Dakota. And they were saying that they were saying that Donald Trump might win New Jersey and lose the other 49 states. Now, of course, all things are possible, but part of a probabilistic forecast is to say some things are less likely than others. And I wasn't involved in any House and Senate forecasts, so I can't really speak to that. But you know, that's like the idea that you can't forecast, that should be captured by the uncertainty in the model. To me, I'll just say one more thing, which is if you want to chew out forecasters, I think it's hard to chew us out sort of a priori for trusting the polls, because we didn't trust the polls. We said that the polls could have systematic error. The only way we really could have done better was to know the direction of the systematic error. Could we have done that? Well, it's not enough that there are systematic errors in 2016, because of course there are errors in the other direction in 2012. There was other information. So there was information about registered voters and new registrations and things like that. You know, arguably that should have been incorporated in some way. It's a challenge. It again gets back to one of Natalie's other points, that it's a matter of, if you really say you are forecasting, then the polls are only one source of information. So I think that there's forecasting, there's snapshots. I don't think there's anything called poll aggregation. I think the concept of poll aggregation, that's BS. Like that doesn't mean anything. Like you're doing it to get a forecast, and let's say it. And then let's say, yeah, here's information about new voter registration and we're not using it. We're making an affirmative decision not to use it. That's your choice. And if you want to argue that we should have, you know, that's, I think one could make a case. People made that case beforehand.
So Andy, let me pick on that, because we have a question from one of the members of the audience that's related to this issue, right? So you're talking about forecasting as an issue of inference based on the data that you have. And so the idea there is like, you pretty much say that if you account for uncertainty and you just put wide conference intervals on that, and it's like a loss of a miss on 3-4 percentage points would not be that problematic, and it's like, and so on. But the main problem is like, and that you mentioned, is like how which are the types of problems. I mean, it's like in this non-standard statistical process that you're facing that may make you believe, right? I mean, that your uncertainty is smaller than it actually is. For instance, right? Is there an issue of temporal persistence, as Nathan Kahneman asked, right? Or spatial correlation, which you account for, or spillover of informations across different networks, and how would you account for those if you had to build those in? Right?
Yeah, we're not really. We're kind of building a kind of dumb statistical model. Like it's
Okay.
we're just saying historically polls have been off. Historically, when you look at errors, they have correlation. Partly, it's kind of what you want your forecast to do. So, if you take the forecast and say, suppose Donald Trump does 2% better than expected in Pennsylvania, how do you think he's going to do in New Jersey, right? Well, maybe 1.5% better, right? So like you can kind of ask yourself some of these questions. There are properties that a forecast should probably have, or if it doesn't have, you should kind of explain why. And one of and the richer your forecast is, the more mistakes it can make, and that's good, right? So if you say that if your forecast gives Joe Biden a 6% chance of winning South Dakota, then I think you should either stand by it and say, well, yeah, this is why this could happen, or you should say, well, there's something wrong with the forecast. You can't necessarily fix everything in time. But it's actually, from a social science point of view, forecasting is a great opportunity to learn. But I think it does require a lot of hard reflection, and you can't be purely empirical, because we only have one election every 2 years. And so you can't just say, like, I'm just going to do it. I'm going to be like Mr. Machine Learning, and then whatever happens, like, I'll just evaluate it afterwards. That's fine if you're predicting thousands of independent events. It just doesn't work when you're doing just one.
But the issue there, I mean, it's like, I think it's one is the issue is the data generating process that's underlying. I mean, it's like what you're trying to predict and how you model that statistically. But the other one is the structure you put into these to try to identify which might be the forces that would tell you that the correlation between New Jersey and Pennsylvania would be 0.5 as opposed to 0.8 or 9 or 0.2. I mean, it's like, so those are, and where would you draw? I mean, it's like to make those types of adjustments to your forecasting model, right? So is it the economy stupid, or is it something else? I mean, it's like, where would it come from, right? Does it vary by election cycle? Does it vary by candidate and so on? Because it will connect to other issues that are being asked here.
Yeah, I think it's there's no easy answer here. I mean, I'm not super proud of what we did in terms of setting up variances and correlations. A lot of it was, we want the forecast to kind of make sense and have what seems to be a reasonable uncertainty and be consistent with some of the literature. I think that precision is tough. I don't think, I mean, we don't know nothing. We know a lot. We have a lot of sense of what's going to happen in the election ahead of time. It is hard to quantify it. I guess I'm cool with quantifying it as well as I can and accepting that there are going to be issues with that.
Speaking of that, I'm going to go back to Natalie. There's a question from Boris, which is related to this. I mean, it's like, so forecasting is faulty. I mean, it's like we do the best we can with the data we have and the models that we build. But Boris reads in your comments that we might be better off not paying attention to forecasters and just trying to rely on the most valuable surveys that we find. I mean, it's like, so the question from him is like, we think we're better off without forecasters or with them. I mean, it's like, what's the previous role? Yeah.
So to be clear, I'm not being any more critical of forecasting and aggregation than I am of anyone else. Like I said, I think it's everyone has acted together to create this expectancy that polls are going to be precise to a level that they're just not capable of being. But I do think, you know, the internet and kind of the democratization of information and the ability to put a poll out there and get attention more than, you know, just have only one network's polls dominating the news. You know, I think that's good to a degree. I think where it has where it has run up on some challenges is the fact that at the same time that polling got much more complicated due to how to reach people, you know, and technology and all of that, it also got cheaper due to the technology and everything. So that allowed more kind of junk to develop. And I think what I'm pushing back on primarily is things that we know are junky and not very well done that make it into models anyway. You know, you certainly shouldn't model based on 1 or 2 polls. I do think more information is great. And, you know, you of course need more information to be able to build models. I'm advocating for using it appropriately and, you know, continuing to think through. And I appreciate how open the Economist team has been with their processes and their thinking, and admitting where there might be flaws, or, you know, it's not a precise thing. It adds information and it's good to look at, but the way it's developed has been built up as this big certain thing. And I think that some of what The Economist has added this cycle that is very good is that nuanced discussion of how you put it together and what other factors go into the uncertainty. So that's kind of a mixed answer. Yes, I do think these products are good things in general, but I think it's how they're used that's been really kind of messy.
Thank you. There's a question in the chat and addressed to, I mean, it's like, I would address it to Scott based on some of the responses, which is this idea that some respondents might be intentionally misrepresenting their vote, or, I mean, and it's related to this idea of the shy Trump voter, or whether or not trusting polls and trusting pollsters might make people, and it's like not truly express their political preferences, and it's like because they feel disenfranchised or whatever other reasons might be. Do you see that as a problem? And does that explain why we see systematic underestimation of the vote for Trump in some areas of the country as opposed to others? And how do we deal with it? Scott, do you want to take that? Or?
Yeah, sure. So my read of this is that there's very little evidence for this idea of a shy Trump voter, right? So people have done list experiments, mode experiments, looked at a variety of different methods of trying to get at these attitudes or vote choice that people aren't willing to express. And from all of the evidence I've seen out there really isn't any good evidence to suggest that people are unwilling to express support for Trump in a survey. Andy,
yeah, I have a quick theory about this. I mean, this is just unfounded, but my theory is that when there's a polling error, let's say there's 3 things you could have. You could have a problem with the voter turnout model. You could have differential non-response, or you could have people giving insincere survey responses. And I think that if you think about a poll, it's like the insincere survey response is accessible. It's very easy to imagine. So it's harder to imagine non-response because you're imagining something that isn't happening. And the harder to think about, the harder to imagine the turnout because it's kind of hidden. But so I conjecture that one reason people talk about the shy Trump or whatever is because it's just such an accessible explanation. It's such an obvious kind of error. So that's all. It's a psychology theory.
There's a related issue here. What can we do about it? And it's like, so is there anything that we can build into our surveys that will allow us to elicit, more truthful responses? And it's like that, what would adjust? And it's like for that unwillingness or even, it's like purposeful misrepresentation of preferences. Right?
There's also, it is funny, and there's no doubt, I mean, there must be some purposeful misrepresentation, but it's kind of a funny thing because it's not actually good for your candidate. I mean, sure, you can say, I'm playing the long game and I'm trying to destroy the news media like bit by bit. But short term, if you say, if you have enough people saying they're not going to vote for Trump, that actually gives a lot of Republicans an incentive to not endorse Trump because they don't think he's so popular. So it's kind of, I'm not saying it doesn't happen. It's funny. It's a funny thing because it's not like, I mean, people do all sorts of irrational things, but it's just like a little bit odd.
So the question there is, if you were to find evidence of that, it would be coming more from the systematic, I mean, Republican voter as opposed to the one that, I mean, it's like that might feel, I mean, shy or, and it's like, or might, I mean, might be not so sure about its support or feel that in their environment it will be shunned upon to support a candidate like Trump.
Yeah, I had a good analogy about the shy Trump voter, or just, you know, people misrepresenting who they're going to vote for in terms of the polls in Maine. And if you know, try and imagine, do you really think people were uncomfortable with expressing support for Susan Collins, who was a very moderate, you know, establishment Republican? And if you sort of think through that logic, it doesn't make a lot of sense to think that's one of the reasons why the polls were off in Maine.
Okay, back to you then, Ms. How do we, or how can we address these challenges, the ones that you mentioned? Is there any way that you can think that we can address the challenges of eliciting people's responses and the chance of eliciting truthful responses, and should we make a big fuss out of it?
So I think it's definitely challenging. In general, nobody who's looked for this type of thing has really found much evidence of people seeming to mislead. So a couple of ways you can assess that kind of post hoc. A lot of pollsters, not a lot, but some pollsters will do callback studies. I know of a couple, Marist, where I started my career, actually in election polling, is doing some callback surveys to people that they talked to before the election. So they're going to call people back and see, you know, did you actually vote? Who did you vote for? You know, if they get inconsistent responses, that obviously is an indicator that maybe people were misleading in the first case. Obviously people could be misleading again, but you know, the likelihood of remembering that you did that, it gets into a lot of counting on people to remember really nuanced things that they probably don't. The other way would be looking at your other questions. You know, does your vote preference question look out of line with your other data? And this is why, you know, I don't consider surveys that only ask a horse race question to be very good, because you need other things in your survey. You need other information to explain why people are voting the way they do. You know, if you're going to spend the money to do a poll, why are you not asking people more than just who they're voting for? You know, at PRRI, we do mostly policy-oriented research. So if our answers to the horse race question are more favorable toward Trump than, say, the proportion of people who support building a wall on the Mexican border, that tells us there's something weird happening, because usually those two things go pretty closely together. Are people who's saying that they're favorable toward Trump but saying that they're going to vote for Biden? That's something that just doesn't happen. You know, if you're favorable toward Trump, you're in Trump's camp. We've seen that time and time again in data over the last 4 years. Like, you're not going to like this guy and vote for someone else. That's not how it works with Trump. So, you know, you look for clues in the rest of your data. Obviously, there is no concrete for sure way to know whether or not someone has lied to you. But I would just reiterate that, you know, there were a lot of studies looking into that after 2016, and I'm sure those studies are being repeated now. And there just wasn't much evidence to really there wasn't any evidence to say that this actually moved any poll results.
Thank you.
Jump in quick, Pablo.
Sure, go ahead.
I just wanted to bring it back to the sort of the psychological motivations here, is that, you know, going back to the weird people who answer these polls, they answer them because there's, you know, a sort of psychological benefit to expressing your opinion, especially for something sort of important to you as your vote choice. So I think people are motivated to tell pollsters the right answer on these types of questions. And so what incentive is there to mislead? While there is some evidence for like trolling, as they've called it, that some survey respondents will give you false answers or inaccurate answers because they get a kick out of it, because they think it's funny to say some weird combination of attitudes. But this kind of thing, I don't think is, first of all, it's not particularly common. You might see 3 to 5% or so in a survey. But it's also happens primarily on the weirder questions. If you ask people about conspiracy beliefs, for example, people might answer some of those affirmatively just because they think it's funny. I think it's a lot less likely to happen on something more mundane like vote choice.
Jason, a question from Boris here about the Hispanic vote, the Latino vote, and what Trump is a floor, and it's like, and maybe other candidates might get more. What's your sense of that? Do you see any potential movement for a Rubio or a Haley getting more than 30% and making a play for the Latino voter or not? And it's like, what's your sense on that? And there's a second question that I got from the chat, which is, what are the challenges? And it's like of polling Hispanic and Latino voters, right? Like you mentioned it at the onset.
Yeah, so, you know, in terms of the challenges, I think sort of there are many who are Spanish language dominant. So making sure that there are Spanish language interviewers and that those Spanish language interviewers are there and that there's not a callback, because oftentimes if you have a callback, you're going to lose a lot of folks. So, so obviously that's important. You know, with Latino voters, you have a lot of sort of lower socioeconomic status, and we know that's more difficult in terms of reaching those groups. So, you know, I think, and as I mentioned before, I mean, these are sort of important things that pollsters who do polls for these particular communities, you know, have to know a lot about those communities to make sure that they're getting the best estimates. In terms of Boris's question, yeah, it's a good question. I mean, parties adapt. You know, there is this sort of, you know, demography is destiny kind of argument in which, you know, Casellas, I think, wrote a book called The Emerging Democratic Majority. And, you know, we see that sort of, you know, we're not seeing sort of that kind of emerging democratic majority because there was this sort of backlash, right, with many sort of the white working class, you know, and so that was not expected. Rather, the sort of growth in the, you know, different race and ethnic groups, you know, that went up. And so I think when we're talking about sort of how things will progress, you know, there have been some kind of movements behind the scenes. And so if you may have seen in the New York Times Magazine this past weekend, an article about the Libre Initiative. It's like one of these Koch-funded initiatives to try to reach out to Latino voters and have them support mostly Republicans, although some conservative Democrats, you know, and provide not only just sort of going out in election time and asking for votes, but sort of this more long-term investment in many Latino communities by, you know, sponsoring workshops or English language kind of programs. And so I think, you know, long term, if Republicans want to reach out to Latino voters, it's important for them to do that in a systematic way that's not just around election time. And it's also true for Democrats that they shouldn't assume that Latino voters will just vote for them automatically and sort of assume the votes, you know, during election time. And so again, if we look at somebody like Rubio, you know, it would be hard to sort of paint him as anti-immigrant, although, you know, certainly he's shifted a little bit in his position since, you know, since when he first ran for president or was in the Senate. But, you know, these kind of things can adapt over time. And, you know, that's what I'll see. And just the broader point about Latinos, again, it's sort of this big group and, you know, micro-targeting to certain Latinos who may be more amenable to a kind of a pro-business, small business kind of message would be something that Republicans would probably go for. Before I move on, I just wanted to get back to this other conversation about And I think USC Dornsife asked this question about who people in your social circle are going to vote for. Does that make any difference in terms of more accurate estimates about elections? I think it was sort of USC in the 2016 election was more spot on than in other years.
I'm very interested in the questions about how do your friends and family plan to vote. I would treat it as data, not as like you can't. It's not clear what to do with that information. It's a little bit like the same thing about the data we have on new voter registration, stuff like that. You can't really take it and transmit it into. But you know, it's possible to do stuff like that, but it's not going to be easy either.
Yeah, we asked a question on are your friends and family voting? We didn't ask who they were voting for, but we did the similar thing on, are you going to turn out to vote? And right. It's interesting, and I agree. It's not necessarily telling you anything, but it is good data to have.
So a question I have for the panel, and it's like, and whoever wants to answer, is there anything that we observe in this cycle that's specific? I mean, that the misses and the errors that we may find might be specific to the cycle, including the candidates. I mean, it's like the pandemic. I mean, it's like and other issues that might have affected. I mean, it's like recession. I mean, it's like in the midst of the electoral cycle and the like. Can you think that any of these would actually, explain whether or not we had systematic errors in polling that would underestimate the support for Trump?
I think there are a few interesting things to watch on this. I think the short answer here is it's kind of too early to tell, because we need all the voting information in to really start diving into what turnout looked like in various places. I've seen some early analyses that show maybe a little bit of depressed Democratic turnout in areas that were harder hit by the pandemic at the moment. You know, those kinds of things are preliminary for the time being. I certainly think we need to make space for the concept that there was nothing about 2020 that was normal, and why would we expect polling to be normal when nothing was? You know, so as far as like polling operations and the back end of things, you know, I think the industry adapted pretty well, and you know, the operations of polling went on, but you know, what did it do to our samples that everyone was in this upheaval? You know, if we're relying on internet panels, you know, who's sitting in front of a computer versus who's not changes in a pandemic. Who's answering the phone versus who's not. You know, we saw a little bit of an uptick in phone response rates at the beginning of the pandemic, and that kind of died away pretty quickly. But, you know, so there are multiple sides of it. There, the operations side, which seems to have adapted pretty well, but, you know, in the, we just don't know yet. But there's also what changed about people's behavior, and what impacted them actually getting out to vote. You know, we had unusually high, like 85, 90% of people saying they were going to turn out to vote, which it's normal that people overestimate their likelihood of voting, but this was really over the top compared to previous years, in my experience, at least. So I think that's part of why you saw a big backlash among the pollsters. You know, when the criticism started, pollsters just immediately said, wait a minute, like, we don't actually know what the answers are. That's a little clearer now. We have a better handle on what the exact gaps are between poll and actual vote. Although some places are still counting, New York City. But you know, that there are just so many unknowns that need deeper analysis, and you know, our information world is not patient and doesn't like to give people time to do that deeper analysis. But that will start to trickle out over the next few months and give us more insight into how exactly, you know, this life upending pandemic impacted everything, including polls.
So relatedly, there's an issue that was raised by several of you. It's like, and I'm happy to elicit your response on this. The idea whether the polls miss on gauging the revelation of individual preferences towards different candidates, as opposed to whether, it's like the polling companies missed out on identifying, it's like, and modeling the likely voters, it's like, in this election. It's like, so I'd be interested in getting your thoughts, it's like, about these two, and which of these two you think is more reflective of the misses that we observed, it's like, in terms of the misses and the hits that we observed in recent polling for this election, both in terms of regional patterns, but also the different subgroups of the population in terms of the responses. So the question is like, are the misses about eliciting, a truthful revelation of preferences, or are the misses about, it's like, do we know who the population of interest, it's like, if we get them, it's like, enough in our sample to be representative of that population, who's the people who go to the polls?
I'm going to be the annoying person who says it's both, because I truly think it is. I think there is reason to be concerned and reason to check into the underlying samples. As Professor Gelman mentioned, we have, you know, who is answering polls these days. We are compensating a lot of people now, you know, as things move more toward internet panels. But, you know, who is picking up, who is answering those panel emails is a good question. And, you know, anytime you have systematic errors in the same direction over time, you need to dig into that. And I pollsters certainly will and are, and as one of them, I am. But I think there's a non-trivial piece of this that, you know, often gets overlooked of likely voter modeling is an educated guess. And we don't get a lot of information about how pollsters go about creating those. You know, there are a lot of assumptions, there's a lot of hand waving, there's, you know, does the education distribution look reasonable? Does the partisan distribution look reasonable? And sometimes you just, what are you basing reasonable on? Are you basing it on 2016? Are you basing it on 2018? This year we had turnout larger than we've ever seen before. So, you know, did we do the same questions that we use to identify likely voters even work in this context? You know, we've kind of gotten lucky in the past where it's generally worked out okay, but is the way we're choosing this population that doesn't even exist. You know, the underpinnings of polls are that we have a population we can sample from. Pre-election polls, we don't even have a population because nobody's voted yet. So we're trying to cut down a different population into this square peg in the round hole of likely voters. And so that's, you know, that's where I argue that pollsters are getting into the prediction business, even though they swear they're not. But it's also where there is a whole lot of space for, you know, if Trump is really getting people out of their, as my boss has said, out of their lazy boys and into the voting booth, you know, is it that they're just not in our survey, or are they in our survey and we just think they aren't likely to vote? And I think both pieces in the end are contributing to these polling errors.
I was muted. On the Q&A, there's a question about something that Natalie raised, but Andy in particular is addressed to Andy. The question is, what do we get from incentivizing voters, and how do we know that that process would lead, I mean, it's like to getting a representative sample of the population of interest. Right? So
you're saying incentivizing voters or pollsters?
Incentivizing survey respondents, sorry.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, well, I think we should pay them. I just think it's kind of, otherwise you're kind of stealing from people. You're taking advantage of them. But I think to say, people would say, well, what kind of response? So if you do a survey with incentives, you're getting extra respondents who are only responding because they're being paid. So you could say, who are those people? I would say they're normal people. Who are those people who would respond without being paid? They're kind of weird. So I reject the idea that somehow not being paid is some sort of reasonable baseline.
So how do you benchmark those panels, I mean, it's like to the population of interest? I mean, that would be the question. So before we had RDD, and to the extent that people responded, we knew that it was a random sample of the population that had phones. That means like it would respond.
Yeah, but it wasn't. RDD was never a random sample. So no, it wasn't. Despite what the president of the American Association for Public Opinion Research said a few years ago, it's actually, there are no probability sample polls that exist. Mathematically, a probability sample is a survey where everyone has a non-zero probability of being in the sample, and you know what those probabilities are, which is ludicrous to think that. No, we would do the same thing with an internet panel that we would do with a telephone survey. We would do Mr. P on it, and it's, non-response is an issue. So survey adjustment, like, only adjust for the things that you adjust for. So it's not, I mean, I understand, like, people who don't like survey adjustment, like, sort of, I understand them, except there are no such people. They're just because everybody does survey adjustment. But there's a moral hazard involved that if you can do good survey adjustment, maybe you could collect crappier data. But I don't really see the moral hazard really happening, because if people are collecting crappy data anyway, I don't think people are collecting crappy data because they're confident that they can adjust away their problems. They're collecting crappy data because it's cheaper to do that, and they think that their clients won't really care. Now, maybe adjustment helps a little bit somewhere along the way. So I do think, yeah, you want to put effort in what Natalie said. You want to put effort into your modeling and also your data collection. It's kind of a weird thing. Like, I don't think it's going to work to do a survey if you don't try really hard to get all those responses, because those people who are hard to reach, like, they're important too. But I think that's an issue under any mode of data collection.
Any other responses to this? So we have about 5 minutes left, and I would like to go around the panelists, and it's like for their final thoughts on these. And it's like it was very instructive and helpful, I believe, and be very interesting in gathering your conclusions about what we have discussed and where we go from here. Let's start with Gail. You wanna start?
Sure. Just picking up on our last discussion, I think, an important point is to think about the ways we can incentivize people to take surveys, because I think we're not going to return to an era where people are going to be doing this for free. Both, and then thinking, about branching out. I mean, we, of course, do this a lot in other public opinion polls, but online, or, especially with younger generations, they're more likely to answer on text message than online or on the phone. And so having these multi-mode surveys is going to be important for both public opinion and election polling.
Jason, you care to go next?
Yeah, just to echo that, I think it's important that we sort of do these incentivizing techniques, and also try to make sure that we're getting, the best estimates as possible. Given, like we just said, 153 million people voted, it's hard to get, you know, the demographics, right? Especially with growing populations, especially populations like the growing Latino population, in which you have so many new voters, right? And sort of how they're going to vote and the ways of reaching them. You know, there has to be sort of a lot of innovation, I think, in terms of how we, you know, reach out to these new generation of voters. You know, texting seems to work, but even then it's sort of difficult because there could be during election time kind of a lot of pushback of too many text messages. But I think, you know, the direction, I think pollsters realize that, you know, there were a lot of problems, right, this past election. And so moving forward, I think there's going to have to be a lot of innovation to try to, you know, to make these polls more relevant again.
Natalie?
Yeah, I'll just add that I think you know, pollsters have some work to do, but so does everyone else. You know, I think for us to see real improvement in the way polls are discussed and treated, you know, like I said, everyone that uses the information that pollsters put out has to participate in helping communicate better, helping educate about the uncertainty that's there. And so I think those are lessons that we're continually learning, and hopefully, you know, I don't want to say, yes, we will see better data in the future, but I think we'll see a lot of thinking about it, a lot of deep consideration. And, you know, if you question, why should I trust polls? Well, maybe you're asking the wrong question. Don't look for reasons to trust polls. Look for ways to understand where they could be telling you something and where they might not be. Look for ways to understand the uncertainty.
Yeah, and let me just echo Natalie's point from earlier that, like, yeah, like, it's not a tragedy if we can't know, you know, right? So like, if like in the Susan Collins was predicted to win 49% of the vote from some from a model, and she actually got whatever it was, 54%, like whatever that was. So that's like, we have to accept that there are errors that are of that size, and that happens. Like that's part of it going forward. Like what happens with when the next thing comes, it doesn't, I mean, it's not like such a horrible thing or such a big deal, right? Because it was, okay, if it's really, even if you thought it was going to be 54-46, that's still pretty close. Both sides are going to campaign hard. So like it's funny how sometimes how little it matters if you move away from the idea of questions like, what are my betting odds, to questions like, what am I going to do? Is this going to affect whether I'm going to turn out to vote? Is this going to affect a campaign decision? You already knew which were going to be the swing states. So it's somehow less, again, like this is all conditional on people accepting the votes and not, you know, mucking up the court system and all the other horrible things that are being done.
That's a great point. I mean, this idea that we have to learn to live with uncertainty, right? It's like, Scott, you want to wrap up here, and I'm going to close it.
Sure. Not too much more to add to all of this. I agree that, I mean, just making contact with people seems to be getting harder and harder. And it's funny because technology has made it so much easier to contact people, but we're competing with so much else. There's so much out there trying to grab our attention all the time that we're going to lose that battle because we're probably doing something less interesting than all the other apps on your phone and all your other opportunities out there. So I don't think there's an easy solution to this problem, unfortunately.
Yeah. Thank you so much. So what we know here is that we set up the pollsters, I mean, it's like very high expectations to tell us what the future might bring. And yeah, we're disappointed that they didn't bring it to the exact, I mean, it's like margin that we got. I mean, it's like, that's a good lesson to learn. Maybe we should lower our expectation of, I mean, it's like based on the bounds on our, I mean, confidence on on the predictions that we make. It was a great panel. I mean, Natalie, Gail, Andy, Jason, Scott, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for joining us. I mean, it's like, and I hope that our audience enjoyed this event. I know I did.
Thank
Okay,
you.
take care.
Thank you.